Hello, welcome to NTI Day 21. I'm going to finish the 1950s America notes and lecture today, and we're going to start off with the baby boom again. But remember, I said there were advancements in medications and things like that. We're going to talk about Jonas Salk. He's the inventor of the polio vaccine. Okay, some famous Americans who had polio: Wilma Rudolph. She was an Olympic gold medalist who overcame polio as a child to medal in the Olympics, and Franklin Roosevelt, who contracted polio in his mid to late 30s. Okay, but this is going to affect millions of people worldwide every year, and basically it could basically paralyze you from the waist down. Okay, Salk is going to invent a vaccine that is going to basically wipe out polio. You don't hear about people getting polio anymore. It's been virtually wiped out except for in very rare cases in very underdeveloped countries around the world. And Salk is basically going to give this vaccine away. The March of Dimes funded his research. People donated money, and so he refused to basically patent that this vaccine. So he didn't make any money off of it, and it's estimated that he gave up $2.5 to $3 billion by not patenting this vaccine. Okay, and so thanks to him, we don't worry about polio anymore. You know, it would be like someone coming up with a cure for the coronavirus right now and not taking any money for it, except, you know, this is something that affected people year after year after year. Hopefully, we won't have to worry about the coronavirus anymore after this. With all these children, parents were trying to, raise their kids as best they can. No parent is perfect. But these people started writing advice books on how to raise your children, and that's still a big thing today. One of the more famous was a guy named Dr. Spock. He was a pediatrician, a small child and a baby doctor. He basically taught that shouldn't spank your kids. I don't know how much I agree with that, but some people go overboard physically when they're punishing their kids, I guess. So that's more what I would argue against. But I know with my kids, a little spanking tends to reset them and remind them that they're not in charge. But anyway, he's one of the first ones to push that idea. One of the big impacts of the baby boom was lots of kids heading to school and lots of toys being invented. Toys became a huge, huge seller during the 50s because there are so many children. The hula hoop and frisbee and all these other things first came out in the 50s because kids wanted stuff to play with. 1958, 1.25 billion toys were sold in America alone. Dollars, $1.25 billion toys were sold. Sorry. All right. You can see there's a little chart. There's a little boy like pushing a mower. You can look at the growth in sales of toys and other things that kids want on there. Number of baseball little leagues. In 1950, there were 776. 1960, there were 5,700. So a lot more kids. So, these things are definitely gonna grow. Um, it's got some celebrities and fads that came out. Um, Women's roles. Let's jump to women's roles. If you've ever seen any old 1950s movies or anything, or TV shows or anything like that, um, it kind of glamorized the home life. Um, Mom stayed at home and the house was immaculately clean and she cooked and did everything. If your mother stays home, and this is no knock on any mothers in case you're watching this, and if you stay at home, in the 50s, they wore dresses and high heels and an apron and cooked pies that were waiting on the windowsill when their kids got home. Um, do any of your mothers cook in high heels? No. I doubt very many did in the 50s either, but that's just how they portrayed it on television. All right. Um, Women wanted to work, but there just weren't as many opportunities. They were limited. They were either like a nurse or a secretary or a teacher, things like that. And in just about every case, they made less than their male counterparts. Okay, so women still weren't as accepted working outside of the home in the 50s as they're going to become later. Um, Americans had more money and they had more leisure time than any time before in their history. People went on these big family vacations. Leisure activities became multi-billion-dollar industries. Camping, driving across country, sports started to make, athletes started to make more money. Sports leagues started to make more money. In 1953, Americans spent $30 billion on leisure. They watched sports and other things on television. They, took up hobbies like bowling and hunting and golf and things like those. Exploded during the 1950s. Fishing, whatever. The automobile culture. By 1960, over 60 million Americans owned cars. A lot of that had to do with a lot of them moving to the suburbs. But, oil, gas was cheap. People were buying things on credit again, which they hadn't done for a while. So, and cars were pretty inexpensive for the time period. So driving in this automobile culture began in the 50s in America. Now, they don't have that in Europe and other places because gas is really expensive and everything's really close together, so you can get there by train. We can't do that here. The easiest way to get somewhere is by car, unless you're going from one side of the country to another. One of the things Eisenhower did during his presidency was the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. This is when the interstates were built all across the country. If you've watched the movie Cars, this is why they pass by Radiator Springs, because of the interstates. And Eisenhower got this idea while in Germany. If you've heard of the Autobahn in Germany, that's what most people know is there's no speed limit. You can drive as fast as you want. The Autobahn was an interstate system in Germany. Okay, and Eisenhower saw it, and he took that idea back with him to America. And when he was president, he implemented it here. Okay, so basically what the interstates did, it linked major cities with other major cities and residential areas, these suburbs and things like that, shopping centers. It made us more connected as a country. It was easier to get from one place to another. But like you see in the movie Cars, it's not good for some of these smaller towns, like Radiator Springs. The impact of the highway, less railroads and travel by rivers, more trucking, more suburbs. You could live further and further away from where you worked and still get there in a reasonable amount of time. It also kind of homogenized America. Little family restaurants died out, and places like McDonald's and other big chain places became more and more popular. All right, so there's some downsides to this, like noise, pollution, accidents, traffic jams, stress, things like that. You know, growing up in Nashville and around Nashville, I've seen a lot of people with road rage. Um, don't see that as much here unless you get stuck behind a tractor, okay, because we don't have bad traffic problems in Union County, okay, but in major urban areas or on these interstates, you will see that, okay, and stress and other, traffic accidents and stuff like that, pollution are major problems in those areas. Um, People, like we said, have begun buying more and more and more stuff. The first credit card appeared in the 1950s, and during the 50s, personal debt increased nearly 3 times because people were buying things on credit again. Okay, because people don't want to wait. People don't like to wait to buy things. Um, in 1948, 9% of homes had televisions. 12 years later, 1960, 90% had televisions. So people were spending more time in front of the TV. And so advertising and things like that became, bigger, especially on television. Um, I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver and My Three Sons and all these other, Mr. Ed, all these famous, you know, shows from the 50s were all made because of television. Um, there's going to be a pushback against all this stuff too. It's called the Beat Movement, and it's mostly young people, and they kind of push back against this, view of American life, and how perfect everything is, because it wasn't perfect. Um, there were problems: alcoholism, divorce, you know, violence, you know, abuse, things like that, all still existed. Okay, but the idea was it didn't. And so, literature, rock and roll, music, all kind of pushed back against this. Um, these were the um, early hippies. Okay, the hippie movement is going to grow out of the beatnik movement. Okay, but rock and roll is going to develop. Um, not what you guys would probably consider rock and roll, but Elvis Presley and people like that are going to basically show up and create a new version of music. Okay, Elvis actually, when he was televised, they would only show him from the waist up because he liked to shake his hips a lot, and that was considered vulgar. And a lot of people didn't like that. Um, Other problems are going to develop. By the early 60s, 1 out of every 4 Americans was living below the poverty line. Um, be interesting to see what that number is today. Um, a lot of them were single parents or elderly, who just couldn't survive. A lot of the Caucasian Americans, white Americans were leaving the big cities for the suburbs. This was called white flight. It took away a lot of tax money and valuable resources, and so major cities started to kind of fall into urban decay. Um, and it wasn't until like the mid 90s that a lot of this was rectified. If you lived in New York City during the 70s, it had the reputation of being a very dangerous place to live because of crime and things like that, because the money moved out. okay, and moved to the suburbs. So that's kind of what's going on in America right now. I've got 3 questions for you. Number 1 is, how much money did Jonas Salk forfeit because he refused to patent the polio vaccination? Number 2 is, what was the kind of idealized life for Americans like in the 50s? Like, how did they portray it? And the third one is, things weren't great for everybody. What were some of the problems, 3 problems that the American people were facing throughout the 50s, kind of in the background and even in the early 60s? All right, so that'll be it for today. I hope you've had a good one.